The recon ship Whistling Kite died without much drama. One moment Jonas Vale was watching a green threat icon crawl across his HUD, tracking a Vectory Patrol Group 2 systems out from where it had any business being, and the next moment the cabin was full of alarms, sparks, and the particular silence that comes after an engine stops working entirely. There was no explosion, no fireball, nothing that belonged in the stories people told about war in the dark. There was just a sudden, sick drop in his stomach, a scream of tearing metal, and then trees. He came to with blood in his mouth and smoke curling along the cracked canopy above him. His restraints had done their job, bruised ribs, a gash above his eyebrow, nothing broken that he could feel, but the ship itself was finished. Through the shattered viewport he could see foreign trees, tall and pale, their bark the color of old bone, growing in dense ranks under a sky gone the color of a healing bruise, purple-gray and streaked with high, thin clouds that moved in patterns no wind he understood could explain. Jonas allowed himself exactly 10 seconds to take stock. That was the rule he'd trained into his own bones over 12 years as a Navy SEAL. Shock gets you killed, but so does moving before you know what you're moving into. 10 seconds. Breathe. Listen. Assess. He'd run this same internal checklist after IED strikes, after fast rope insertions gone wrong, after a helicopter crash in a mountain range that didn't have a name on any map he'd ever seen. The counting worked the same way here as it had everywhere else. 10 seconds bought clarity that panic never would. Ribs bruised, not broken. Left knee stiff but load-bearing. Sidearm still holstered. Comm unit dead, its housing cracked open like an egg, wiring exposed and sparking weakly. Emergency beacon, also dead, crushed under a support strut that had folded in on itself during the crash. The housing split clean through. That last part mattered more than anything else in the cockpit. No beacon meant no signal. No signal meant nobody was coming, not for a long time, maybe not ever. Command would log the Whistling Kite as lost with all hands within 72 hours if no contact was re-established. Nobody would be sent looking for a ghost. He unbuckled, checked the cabin for anything usable, and salvaged what he could: a combat knife, 40 meters of paracord, a half-charged multi-tool, 3 days of ration bars, a med kit that had survived the crash mostly intact, and a canteen that had somehow held together despite the violence of the landing. Small mercies. He'd take them. Then he stripped his uniform of anything that read as military, rank insignia, unit patches, anything with a serial number, not because he expected company, but because that was also the rule. Assume contact. Prepare for contact. Never let your gear tell your story before you're ready to tell it yourself. He tucked the patches into a hidden seam pocket rather than discarding them. If he made it home, he wanted them back. If he didn't, it wouldn't matter either way. He stepped out into the alien forest and understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, exactly how much trouble he was in. The trees weren't trees. Not really. They had the general shape of trees, trunks, branches, something like foliage, but the bark pulsed faintly under his palm when he touched it, warm in a way wood never was, and the leaves moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm that had nothing to do with wind. The air smelled of something sweet and slightly rotten, like fruit left too long in a warm room, undercut by a mineral tang he couldn't place. And under his boots, the ground wasn't soil. It was something closer to cartilage, springy and faintly warm, giving slightly with each step like the surface of something breathing very slowly, very deeply, somewhere far below. He was not on a moon in any conventional sense. He was standing on the surface of something alive. Jonas had been briefed, in the vague and half-informed way command briefed anyone before a recon run, on the working theory of vectory biology. Their homeworlds were said to be organized not as cities and nations, but as vast, interconnected nesting structures, biological megastructures grown rather than built, centered on breeding chambers that served as both cradle and capital, spreading outward across entire moons and small planetoids like coral spreading across a reef. If the theory was right, and if his read on the terrain was right, he had crash-landed directly into the middle of one. That was the worst possible place to be found. He moved anyway, because standing still accomplished nothing, working a rough perimeter around the wreck, looking for high ground, for a defensible position, for anything that would buy him time to think through what came next. He found none of it. The terrain rolled gently in every direction, the pale trees thinning here and there into open clearings that looked, on closer inspection, disturbingly like the mouths of tunnels leading down into the moon's crust. 40 minutes later, he was found anyway. They came out of the tree line without sound, 6 of them, moving on 4 limbs with a fluid, insectal grace that made his skin crawl in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with instinct, the ancient, reptile brain recognition of a predator's gait, honed over millions of years of evolution he had no way of overriding no matter how much training sat on top of it. They were armored in something that looked grown rather than forged, chitinous plates the color of dried blood, layered and overlapping like scales, and they carried weapons that hummed with a low, unpleasant frequency, the sound settling into his back teeth like the buzz of a dentist's drill. Jonas did the math in half a second. 6 of them, armed, coordinated, moving with the confidence of hunters who knew their terrain intimately. One of him, injured, in unfamiliar terrain, with no extraction and no support. This was not a fight. This was a moment to survive, and surviving meant recognizing, quickly and without ego, when the odds demanded patience instead of resistance. He raised his hands slowly, keeping his expression neutral, his weapon holstered and visible so they'd know he wasn't reaching for it. It didn't matter. They took him anyway, roughly but without excessive violence, binding his wrists with a cord that felt disturbingly organic, warm and slightly sticky, like it was still growing, still connected to something. As they marched him deeper into the nest, Jonas kept his eyes moving, cataloging everything, chamber sizes, guard rotations, structural seams in the walls, the rhythm of the place's breathing. Because that was the only way to describe the slow expansion and contraction he began to notice in the tunnel walls, as if the entire structure were a single enormous lung, drawing breath on some vast, unhurried timescale that made him feel, for the first time in a long career of feeling very small in very large places, genuinely insignificant. He filed it all away. He didn't know yet what he'd need it for. But 12 years of training had taught him one truth above all others: information was the only weapon they hadn't taken from him, and it was the one weapon they didn't know he still had. Somewhere behind the calm, blank expression he wore for his captors, a part of his mind was already building a map, one corridor at a time, the way he'd been trained to build target packages long before anyone in this galaxy had a word for what he was. The march took nearly an hour, winding downward through a series of gradually widening tunnels, and Jonas used every minute of it. He noted the way the 6 guards arranged themselves around him, 2 ahead, 2 behind, 1 on each flank, and clocked the gaps in that formation whenever the tunnel narrowed and forced them into a looser single file. He noted the texture changes in the walls as they descended, the outer corridors rougher and more recently grown, the deeper passages smoother, older, worn by what he guessed were countless generations of traffic. He noted the smell shifting too, the sweet rot of the surface giving way to something muskier, warmer, tinged with the coppery edge he'd later come to associate with the nursery chambers. At one junction, the group paused while the lead guard consulted with another patrol crossing their path, and for perhaps 15 seconds, Jonas stood essentially unguarded in the gap between the two groups, his hands bound but his body otherwise free. He didn't run. Running here, this early, with no map, no plan, and 500 meters of hostile territory between himself and open ground, would have been suicide dressed up as initiative, the kind of mistake that got young operators killed and experienced ones warned about it for the rest of their careers. He stood still instead, eyes down, shoulders slack, cataloging the layout of the junction itself, the number of branching corridors, the rough compass bearing back toward the surface based on the angle of what little natural light still reached this depth. It was a small thing, standing still when every instinct told him to run. But small things, stacked patiently on top of each other, were the only kind of things that had ever gotten him out of situations like this one alive. They kept him in a holding cell for what he estimated was 11 hours, no windows, no clocks, only the pulse of the walls to measure time by, slow and steady, like a heartbeat he didn't want to think about too hard. He used the time productively, the way he'd been trained to use every scrap of downtime in captivity, because idle time in an enemy's hands was time the enemy controlled, and controlling his own time, even in small ways, was the first step toward controlling anything at all. He tested the give of the walls, soft on the surface, but reinforced with something fibrous beneath, a texture his fingers memorized through slow, repeated pressure. He tested the strength of his bindings, discovering that the material seemed to weaken slightly with dry friction, a detail he tucked away without knowing yet how he'd use it. He ate half a ration bar, drank sparingly from his canteen, and slept for 2 hours in short, disciplined intervals, the way he'd trained himself to do in worse places than this, a container ship's hold once, a collapsed building another time, places where sleep had to be stolen in pieces rather than taken whole. When they came for him, it was with more guards than before, 8 this time, plus a 9th figure that moved differently from the rest, taller, more deliberate, wearing markings the others didn't have, a kind of ceremonial scoring etched into the chitin along its forelimbs. An escort commander, Jonas guessed. Or a herald? Someone whose job was to walk him towards something important, and who clearly took a professional pride in the walking itself, setting a measured pace that Jonas matched without complaint. They marched him through a series of chambers that grew progressively larger and more ornate, the cartilage-like walls giving way to something almost architectural, ribbed columns thick as sequoias, arched ceilings that vanished into shadow far overhead, bioluminescent growths clustered like chandeliers, casting a soft blue-green light over everything, pulsing gently in a rhythm that seemed to sync, disturbingly, with the pulse he'd felt in the cell walls. It would have been beautiful, in a way that made his neck prickle, if he hadn't understood exactly what kind of place he was being walked into. The throne chamber, when they reached it, was enormous. The ceiling arched 60 feet overhead, ribbed like the inside of a ribcage, and at the far end of the chamber, raised on a dais of fused biomass, sat the queen. She was larger than Jonas expected, easily 3 times the size of her guards, her lower body a segmented mass that flowed into the dais itself, as if she had grown into her throne rather than simply sitting on it, roots of pale, sinewy tissue disappearing into the biomass beneath her in a way that suggested she was as much a part of this structure as its walls were. Her upper body was more humanoid in proportion, for arms folded in a posture of coiled patience, each hand tipped with claws that caught the ambient light in sharp, cold glints. Her head was crowned with a crest of bone-white spines, flared wide in what he'd later come to understand was a display of authority, and her eyes, 6 of them, arranged in 2 vertical rows down the sides of her face, tracked him the moment he entered the chamber, and he felt the weight of that attention like a physical pressure against his skin, the specific, primal discomfort of being assessed by something that had never once, in its entire existence, needed to fear him. They forced him to his knees before the dais. He let them. There was no percentage in resisting 8 guards and a queen with 4 arms in a chamber he didn't control, 30 meters from an exit he hadn't even located yet. The queen studied him for a long moment before she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was translated through some device worn by the herald beside her, a flat, buzzing approximation of speech that still carried an unmistakable note of contempt, every syllable clipped and precise in a way that suggested the translation software had been calibrated, deliberately or not, to render disdain with perfect clarity. "A soft one," she said. "Unarmored. Unarmed. You wear no marks of rank, no marks of purpose. You are not a warrior. You are not even prey worth the effort of a hunt. You are a curiosity. A scientist, perhaps, or a wandering fool who stumbled into my nest by accident." Jonas said nothing. He kept his face carefully blank, not defiant, not afraid, just empty, the face of a man who had nothing worth hiding because he had nothing worth knowing. It was a mask he'd worn before, in rooms far worse than this one. Rooms with concrete floors and bare bulbs and men who'd studied interrogation as a craft, and it fit as easily now as it ever had, the muscles of his face settling into it the way a hand settles into a familiar glove. "You will tell me what I wish to know," the queen continued, "or you will be given to the young." She gestured with one of her lower arms toward a side chamber, where Jonas caught a glimpse of movement, pale, writhing shapes, dozens of them, packed into a nursery chamber that smelled of copper and rot, the sound of their hunger a low, constant hiss that carried even across the width of the throne room. "They are always hungry. It would be a small mercy compared to what my interrogators could do, but I find mercy tends to loosen tongues faster than pain does. Where are the fleet positions of your people? How many ships guard this system? What are the defenses of your nearest colony?" Jonas kept his eyes on the middle distance, somewhere just past the queen's crest, and let the silence stretch. He had exactly one advantage in this room, and it was this: she thought she already knew what he was. A soft one. A curiosity. Someone who could be broken open like an egg for whatever secrets rattled around inside. She had no idea what she was looking at. "I don't have that information," he said finally, in a flat, unremarkable voice. It wasn't even entirely a lie. He didn't have current fleet positions, that intelligence had died with his beacon, and what little he'd known before the crash was already stale, 3 days old and shifting by the hour in the way fleet dispositions always did. "I'm a technician. I fix things. I got lost." The queen's crest flared slightly, something like interest or irritation, the spines catching the light as they lifted. "A technician who survives a crash unharmed, who does not weep, who does not beg. Interesting. Perhaps you are simply better trained in deception than my interrogators are used to." She leaned forward, and even from 30 feet away, Jonas felt the pressure of that movement in his chest, an involuntary tightening he refused to let show on his face. "You have 3 days. In 3 days, you will tell me what I wish to know, or you will feed my young, and I will find someone less composed to ask instead. Take him to the outer cells. Let him watch the nest breathe for a while. It has a way of loosening even quiet tongues." They dragged him from the chamber. Jonas let them, cataloging the exits, the guard positions, the structural weak points in the ceiling ribs as they went, filing every detail away with the same patient discipline he'd used to memorize target compounds in a dozen countries whose names most people back home couldn't spell or find on a map even if you gave them one. 3 days. He had 3 days to turn a death sentence into an opportunity. He'd worked with less. Interlude, what 12 years buys you? He thought about it later, lying in the dark of that cell with the walls breathing slow around him. How strange it was that everything he needed to survive this had been built years ago, in places that had nothing to do with alien moons or living hive nests, and everything to do with cold water and colder instructors and a version of himself that had almost quit more than once. Jonas had been 22 when he first stood on the grinder at Coronado, soaked and shivering and watching men beside him ring the brass bell that meant they were done. That meant they'd chosen warm blankets and hot coffee over whatever came next. He hadn't rung it. He couldn't have told anyone, then or later, exactly why. It wasn't pride, not really, and it wasn't some clean, movie-ready sense of destiny. It was something smaller and more stubborn than either of those things. A simple refusal to let the version of himself that quit be the one that got to define him. The training that followed had taught him things no recruiting poster ever mentioned. It taught him that panic was a choice, not a reflex, no matter how much it felt like the opposite in the moment. It taught him that the body could do far more than the mind believed it could, and that most limits people carried around with them were negotiated, not fixed, the kind of thing you could push back simply by refusing to accept where someone else had drawn the line. It taught him patience most of all, the particular, grinding patience of lying motionless in mud for 6 hours during a training exercise, learning to let discomfort become background noise instead of emergency, learning that the difference between a professional and an amateur was rarely raw skill and almost always the ability to do nothing, perfectly, for exactly as long as nothing was the correct thing to do. None of that had anything to do with alien biology, with dried fiber and glowing nutrient trunks and crests that flared when a queen felt something close to fear. But all of it had everything to do with how he'd survived 3 days in a cell that could have crushed a lesser-trained mind in 3 hours. The specific knowledge, the structural read on the walls, the patient dismantling of a nest from the inside, that was new, improvised, built moment by moment out of whatever the situation offered him. The discipline underneath it, the thing that let him build that knowledge instead of dissolving into fear, was 12 years old, hard-won, and the only truly reliable weapon he'd carried into that throne room. He thought, too, about the men he'd served beside over those 12 years, some still serving, some not, a handful gone entirely, names on a wall back home that he visited when he could and thought about when he couldn't. None of them would ever hear this particular story, not the classified version anyway, and there was a strange, lonely comfort in that. Whatever happened in this nest, win or lose, live or die, it would join a long list of things he'd done that nobody outside a very small, very trusted circle would ever fully understand. He'd made his peace with that trait a long time ago, back on a grinder in Coronado, back when ringing a bell would have been so much easier than not ringing it. The Queen thought she was looking at a soft, frightened technician. What she was actually looking at was the accumulated weight of 12 years spent training for exactly this kind of impossible math. One man, no support, an environment built to kill him, and a problem that could only be solved by turning patience into a weapon sharper than anything the situation had handed him. She had no framework for what that training represented, no equivalent in her own species' experience to measure it against. That gap in her understanding was, in the end, the single largest advantage Jonas carried into that throne room. Larger than the knife, larger than the paracord, larger than anything else in his depleted kit. The outer cell was better than he expected and worse than he wanted. Better, because it had a narrow gap in the wall, not a window exactly, more like a pore in the nest's outer membrane, that let in thin shafts of the moon's actual daylight and a trickle of real air, cool and mineral-scented compared to the thick, sweet atmosphere deeper inside. Worse, because that same gap told him exactly how deep inside the structure he was, 3, maybe 400 meters from the outer wall, judging by the muffled quality of the light and the total absence of any true sound from outside, no wind, no wildlife, nothing but the endless, patient pulse of the nest around him. He spent the first several hours doing what SEER training had drilled into him a decade ago, back in a classroom that felt impossibly distant now, back when the enemy in the scenario had at least been human. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. Survival first. He inventoried his body, the bruised ribs were healing, tender but manageable, the gash on his brow had scabbed clean, dehydration was a growing concern but not yet critical, his rationed canteen giving him perhaps another day and a half if he was careful. He kept his mind occupied, because idle minds in captivity turned inward and rotted, replaying fears and regrets in an endless loop that served no purpose except to wear a man down from the inside, and he had seen what that did to good operators in bad situations, watched it happen to men stronger than he considered himself. He thought, briefly, of the training compound back home, not with nostalgia exactly, but as a kind of anchor, a reminder that this was not the first impossible situation he'd been dropped into and talked his way, planned his way, fought his way out of. He remembered an instructor once telling a class of exhausted, half-drowned candidates that the only difference between the ones who made it through Hell Week and the ones who didn't was that the ones who made it never let themselves think in terms of the whole ordeal, only the next 5 minutes. 5 minutes. That was the whole trick. Jonas held on to it now the way he'd held on to it then. He thought about the deployments that had followed that first, brutal season of training, a decade spent moving through places most people back home would never be able to find on a map, doing work that rarely made headlines and almost never came with the kind of clean resolution civilians expected from a story. He'd learned, over those years, that the missions that looked simplest from the outside were often the hardest, and the ones that looked impossible were sometimes, if you broke them down patiently enough, simply a long chain of small, manageable decisions stacked one on top of the other. A Hive Queen's throne room, 3 levels above a structural weak point he hadn't even known existed 48 hours earlier, was just one more chain like that. It didn't feel any different, in its bones, from 100 other situations he'd talked himself into surviving. It just had a stranger shape. Evasion came next, in a form suited to his circumstances. He made himself boring. He answered nothing during the brief checks his guards made. He reacted to nothing. When guards came to look in on him, he sat with his back to the wall, eyes half closed, breathing slow, not drugged, not broken, just profoundly uninteresting, a man who had clearly given up, or who had never had much fight in him to begin with. It was a technique, not an accident. Predators lose interest in prey that stops struggling in ways they can predict, that offers no resistance worth watching. He wanted the Queen's attention elsewhere while he worked, wanted his guards to grow complacent, to stop truly looking at him even when they were technically watching him. Resistance meant something different here than it usually did. He wasn't going to outfight this nest, the numbers made that mathematically absurd, and he had never been a man who mistook bravado for strategy. He was going to outthink it. And so, over the following 2 days, while his guards grew steadily more bored and less careful, exactly as he'd hoped, Jonas Vale began to map the beast from the inside, one small, patient observation at a time. He listened to the walls. Their pulse was not random, it had a rhythm, faster near what he guessed were major junctions, slower in the dead-end chambers like his cell, a variation he could track by simply lying still with his palm flat against the fibrous surface and counting. He tracked the guard rotations by ear, counting footfalls, noting the gaps between patrols, noting that the same 2 guards seemed to walk the same corridor at what he estimated was 6-hour intervals, their pace slowing measurably by the second day as boredom set in. He tested the wall material every chance he got, working a loosened fiber between his fingers during the hours he was alone, discovering that the fibrous understructure, the actual load-bearing tissue beneath the soft outer membrane, dried and stiffened when exposed to air for extended periods, becoming brittle in a way the living tissue wasn't, a fact he confirmed by snapping a dried fragment between 2 fingers and hearing it crack like old bone. That discovery mattered more than anything else he learned in that cell. If the nest's structural integrity depended on living, moist tissue, then anything that dried it out, damaged it, or cut off its blood supply, its nutrient supply, whatever the equivalent was, would weaken it. Not just locally. Structurally. Possibly catastrophically, if he found the right places to apply that weakness. He turned the idea over for hours, testing it against everything he knew about demolition, about load-bearing structures, about the specific vulnerabilities of anything grown rather than built, anything that depended on continuous circulation to stay strong. On the second day, they brought a translator to question him again, not the herald from the throne room, but a lower-ranked functionary, younger, with a translation device that stuttered on English's more complex constructions, occasionally rendering entire sentences as a burst of confused static before settling back into a broken approximation of speech. Jonas played the frightened technician for him, badly, on purpose, letting just enough fear show to seem plausible while giving up nothing of value, a stammer here, a flinch there. The careful theater of a man barely holding himself together. He asked, in the meek voice of a man trying to bargain for his life, simple questions in return: how long had the nest stood? How many chambers did it hold? Was the queen always at its center? The functionary, flattered to be asked and unaware he was being mapped rather than pleaded with, answered more than he should have, his pride in his own knowledge of the nest's structure outweighing whatever caution his training might otherwise have demanded. There was a second guard, too, one who returned more often than the others during that second day, an older soldier, judging by the wear on his chitin plating and the slow, deliberate way he moved compared to the younger guard's quicker, more nervous energy. This one didn't ask questions. He simply watched, for long stretches, standing just outside the cell with his weapon slung and his 6-jointed hands loosely clasped, studying Jonas the way a hunter studies a track it doesn't quite recognize. On the second evening, he struck Jonas once, without warning, without any question preceding it, a short, testing blow across the jaw that snapped Jonas's head sideways and left his ears ringing. Jonas took it the way he'd taken worse, absorbing the impact, letting his body go loose rather than tense, folding sideways with the force of the blow instead of bracing against it, because bracing telegraphed strength, and strength was the one thing he needed this guard to keep believing he didn't have. He stayed down afterward, breathing hard, letting a thin thread of blood run from his split lip, and said nothing at all, no plea, no curse, nothing that would give the guard the satisfaction of a reaction to study. The guard crouched down after a moment, tilting his head in a gesture that translated, even across species, as puzzlement. He said something in the clicking, buzzing language of his people, untranslated, unheard by any device, and then straightened and walked away, apparently satisfied, or perhaps simply bored, that he'd confirmed whatever he'd come to confirm. Jonas lay still for a long moment afterward, cataloguing the ache in his jaw with the same clinical detachment he applied to everything else in this place. Filing away one more small data point, this guard tested for reaction, not information. He was probably reporting back to someone higher up the chain, someone who wanted a read on the prisoner's temperament before deciding how hard to push during the coming interrogations. That, too, was useful to know. It told Jonas that somewhere above the ordinary guards and the eager young functionary, someone more careful was starting to pay closer attention to him than he'd like. By the end of the second day, Jonas had a mental blueprint of the nest's major structure: outer defensive rings, mid-level nurseries and storage chambers, and at the absolute center, 3 levels down from the throne room, a chamber the functionary had called, in halting translation, the root, the place where the nest's central nutrient trunk anchored into the moon's crust, feeding the entire structure the way a spine feeds a body or a keel holds together the hull of a ship. The root. That was the word Jonas kept turning over in his mind as he lay in the dark that night, listening to the slow, steady pulse of the walls around him, feeling it now not as a threat but as a target, a rhythm he was beginning to understand well enough to disrupt. He didn't need to kill the queen. He needed to find her spine and break it, carefully, precisely, with exactly enough force and no more, the way he'd been trained to bring down a structure without bringing down everything around it. By the third day, Jonas had a plan, and plans required action, so he began, carefully and quietly, to act. He started small. During one of his interrogation sessions, the Queen had grown impatient and begun sending guards more frequently now, their questions sharper, their patience thinner, one of them going so far as to strike him once across the face when his non-answers grew too repetitive, a blow he absorbed without complaint because complaint would have suggested he had something worth protecting. He managed to work a fragment of dried structural fiber, no bigger than a fingernail, out of the cell wall and into his sleeve during the confusion. It wasn't much, but it told him something crucial. Dried fiber, when struck against metal, produced a spark, faint but real, when he tested it privately against the buckle of his own boot. Whatever this nest was made of, it wasn't fireproof, and fire, even a small one, even one that never fully caught, was one more tool in a toolkit that had started with almost nothing. He didn't have a way to start a real fire yet, not without risking discovery long before he was ready. But he filed the information away, the way he'd filed away everything else, building a picture piece by piece the way he'd been trained to build target packages back when target packages were made of satellite photos and human intelligence instead of alien biology and desperate improvisation. On the third night, he'd started counting nights by the color shift in the light seeping through his cell's membrane pore, a shift from pale gray to a deeper, bruised purple that seemed to mark the moon's slow rotation away from its sun. A guard rotation error gave him his first real opportunity. The 2 guards who usually walked the corridor together split up, one called away to deal with some disturbance deeper in the nest, its cause unclear but its urgency evident in the speed with which the guard departed, the other left alone outside Jonas's cell, bored, inattentive, his weapon slung rather than held ready, his posture the loose, unguarded stance of a soldier who had stopped believing anything interesting was going to happen on this particular watch. Jonas didn't hesitate. He'd been waiting for exactly this kind of gap, And 12 years of training had taught him that hesitation was its own kind of death sentence, that opportunities in hostile environments rarely announced themselves twice. He worked the last threads of his bindings loose, weakened over 3 days of patient, invisible friction against the cell's rougher wall surfaces, slipped free, and moved. He didn't kill the guard. That would have been the easy choice and the wrong one. A body found too soon would end the opportunity before it began, would trigger a lockdown that turned 3 days of patient preparation into wasted effort. Instead, he closed the distance in 3 silent steps, applied a hold he'd used 100 times in training and a dozen times for real, an arm across the throat, careful, controlled pressure, and put the guard to sleep without a sound, laying him down gently enough that a casual glance would read it as a lapse in duty rather than an attack, propping him against the corridor wall in a posture that might, to an incurious eye, look like a soldier who'd simply dozed off on watch. Then Jonas moved. He didn't run. Running was for people who didn't know where they were going, and running here, in a structure this vast and unfamiliar, would only exhaust him and draw attention faster than a measured pace ever would. He moved with purpose, using the mental map he'd built over 3 days of patient observation, staying low, staying to the darker seams between the bioluminescent growths, counting patrol gaps, letting the rhythm of the nest's breathing mask the rhythm of his own footsteps, timing each stride to fall within the structure's own expansion and contraction so that any vibration he caused would blend into the ambient movement rather than stand out against it. He didn't go for the exit. That was the part that would have surprised anyone watching, if anyone had been watching. He went down, toward the root, toward the center of the thing that had swallowed him 3 days ago, past corridors that grew narrower and darker as he descended, past storage chambers filled with materials he couldn't identify and didn't stop to examine, past a wide, open space he skirted carefully after glimpsing movement within it, unwilling to risk contact he couldn't control. Along the way, he did what damage he could, quickly and quietly, the way a man plants seeds rather than the way a man swings a hammer. He found narrow structural seams, support ribs where the nest's growth had thinned the tissue to work around some existing geological feature, a boulder or a fault line the structure had simply grown around rather than through, and he weakened them. A cut here with his salvaged knife, dried fiber packed into a stress point there, small sabotage that wouldn't show for hours or days but would matter enormously when the right kind of pressure was finally applied, each one a small, deliberate wound in a body too vast to notice a handful of scratches. He found a secondary nutrient duct, thick as his torso, pulsing with the visible rhythm of the walls around it, glowing faintly blue-white beneath its translucent outer casing, and he didn't touch it, not yet. That was too soon, too loud, too likely to bring guards running before he understood the whole structure. Instead, he memorized its path, tracing it with his eyes toward the deeper dark, toward the root, committing every branch and junction to memory the way he'd once memorized floor plans for buildings he'd only ever see once, in the dark, under fire. By the time the alarm finally went up, not from the sleeping guard, who wouldn't wake for another hour, but from a routine patrol that noticed an unlocked cell and an empty space where a prisoner should have been, Jonas was already 3 chambers deeper into the nest than anyone expected him to be, and he had a plan that no longer depended on escape. He was going to bring the whole structure down around the Queen's throne. And he was going to do it without killing her. The chamber the young functionary had called the root was unlike anything else Jonas had seen in the nest. Where the throne room had been grand and ceremonial, and the outer corridors functional and narrow, the root chamber was purely, Brutally structural, a vast open space, easily 200 meters across, dominated by a central trunk of pulsing, fibrous tissue that rose from the chamber floor and disappeared upward through a massive shaft in the ceiling, presumably connecting directly to the throne room 3 levels above, exactly as he'd mapped it in his head over 2 days of careful listening. The trunk was thick as a house, wrapped in the same dried, semi-brittle outer layer he'd been testing for 2 days, and threaded through with visible channels of something that moved like blood but glowed faintly, blue-white, pulsing in time with the walls throughout the entire nest, a slow, hypnotic rhythm that Jonas found himself unconsciously matching his own breathing to before he caught himself and broke the pattern deliberately. This was the heart of the thing. Cut this, and everything above it would feel the wound. Jonas had maybe 20 minutes before the search parties reached this level. He could hear the alarm calls echoing down through the chambers above, a rising chorus of clicks and buzzes that needed no translation device to understand as urgency, growing steadily closer, steadily more coordinated. 20 minutes to turn a spinal column into a detonator. Less time than he'd have liked. More time than he'd expected to get. He worked fast, methodical, drawing on training that had nothing to do with alien biology and everything to do with structural demolition. The kind of training that taught a man to look at any large, load-bearing structure and see, instantly, the handful of points where a small, precise application of force could bring the whole thing down without leveling everything around it. He didn't have explosives. He had a knife, dried fiber, a multi-tool, and about 400 meters of paracord, and he had to make that be enough. The way it had been enough before, in other buildings, in other countries, against other enemies who'd also underestimated exactly what a determined man with limited tools could accomplish given enough patience. He identified 3 primary support struts where the root's outer casing had thinned naturally around embedded rock formations. Weak points the nest had grown around rather than through, exactly the kind of flaw that made the difference between a structure that stood and one that fell. The same principle that governed every building he'd ever been trained to bring down. At each one, he packed dried fiber deep into the existing cracks, working it in tight, layering it the way he'd been trained to layer breaching charges, though this improvised version relied on friction and mechanical stress rather than explosives, on tension rather than detonation, a slower, quieter kind of destruction that suited his situation far better than anything louder would have. Then he did the part that made his pulse spike despite 12 years of training that was supposed to make him immune to exactly this kind of fear. He cut, carefully, into the outer casing of the trunk itself, exposing a narrow channel of the glowing internal tissue, close enough that the warmth of it radiated against his hand even through his glove. Not enough to sever anything vital. Just enough to expose it, to weaken the surrounding structure, to create a single critical point where the right kind of pressure, applied correctly, would do more damage than the wound itself suggested, the way a single cut tendon could bring down a limb far heavier than the blade that severed it. Between the second and third strut, Jonas paused just long enough to test something he'd been turning over since the second day of captivity, whether the glowing nutrient fluid reacted at all to open air the way the surrounding tissue did. He drew a shallow line across the exposed channel with the edge of his knife, no deeper than a scratch, and watched the blue-white glow along the wound dim, slowly, over the space of perhaps 30 seconds. The surrounding tissue visibly stiffening as it did, exactly the reaction he'd hoped for and needed to confirm before he trusted his entire plan to it. It wasn't blood exactly, or not blood the way he understood the word, but it behaved enough like a circulatory fluid that starving a section of it, even briefly, produced real structural consequences. That single scratch, more than anything else he did in that chamber, told him the whole plan would actually work rather than simply sounding plausible in his own head. He worked the second strut faster than the first, more confident now, packing the dried fiber deeper, wedging it with the flat of his knife blade to maximize the stress it would place on the surrounding tissue once the paracord line went taut. The third strut gave him more trouble. Its natural weak point sat higher on the trunk than the other two, forcing him to climb a short section of the root's ribbed exterior, fingers and boots finding purchase in the deep grooves between segments. Every second spent climbing a second he wasn't spending watching the chamber's entrances for the search party he knew was coming. He finished it anyway, breathing hard, sweat stinging the cut above his eyebrow, and dropped back down to ground level just as the first distant echo of voices, buzzing, urgent, multiplying, reached him from the tunnel he'd come down through. He was rigging the strut lines with paracord, 3 separate lines, each running from a weakened point back to a single convergence. Tension just short of the breaking point, a spiderweb of stress he could trigger from a distance with one hard pull, when the first search party found him. There were 6 of them, weapons raised, moving with the same fluid, insectal speed he remembered from the forest 3 days ago, fanning out into the chamber with the practiced coordination of soldiers who trained together often. Jonas didn't run. There was nowhere left to run to, and running now would waste the 20 minutes of work he'd just finished, would abandon a plan that was so close to complete. Instead, he did the only thing that made tactical sense. He made himself the target, drawing their attention toward him and away from the 3 rigged strut points at his back, backing slowly toward the deepest shadow the chamber offered, buying seconds, always buying seconds, because seconds were the only currency he had left, and he'd learned long ago how to make every last one of them count. "Easy," he said, in the meek, defeated voice he'd been performing for 3 days, hands raised, backing away, letting his shoulders slump in a posture of surrender he didn't feel. "I'm not armed. I'm not fighting." It bought him almost enough time. Almost. Interlude, the space between. They didn't take him straight to the throne room after the search party cornered him in the root chamber. There was a stretch of perhaps 20 minutes, unaccounted for in any tidy version of the story, where 6 guards marched him back up through the levels he'd descended hours earlier, and where Jonas, bound again, bleeding lightly from a shallow cut along his forearm where a guard's claw had caught him during the brief scuffle at the root, did the only thing left available to him. He kept working. Not sabotage this time. There was no more time or opportunity for that, and he knew it. What he did instead was quieter, and in its own way just as important. He watched, and he planned the negotiation he now understood he was going to have to survive long enough to deliver. He listened to the guards around him, to the rhythm of their clicks and buzzes, and though he understood none of the language itself, he'd spent enough of his career reading tone across cultures that had no shared words at all to recognize something in the cadence of this particular conversation, an argument, unmistakably, 2 of the 6 guards clearly disagreeing about something as they marched, their pace subtly uneven, their body language stiff in a way it hadn't been on the way down. He filed that away too. Disagreement among the guards meant disagreement somewhere higher up the chain as well, and disagreement was the kind of crack a good negotiator learned to work into, patiently, the same way he'd worked dried fiber into a stress point in the root chamber's support struts. He thought, too, in that walk, about what he actually wanted out of whatever came next, separate from the tactical question of surviving the next hour. He'd come into this nest by accident, a downed pilot with no orders covering exactly this scenario, and every decision since the crash had been made on instinct, training, and whatever information the moment offered him. But somewhere in the root chamber, watching that glowing fluid dim under his knife, he'd stopped simply reacting and started, for the first time since the crash, actually planning an outcome beyond his own survival. 31 prisoners. A wounded nest. A queen who was about to learn, in the most direct terms possible, exactly how badly she'd misjudged the man kneeling in front of her throne 3 days ago. By the time they reached the throne room's outer approach, Jonas had the shape of the negotiation to come mapped out almost as clearly as he'd mapped the nest's corridors. Not the exact words, because those would depend entirely on what the moment gave him to work with, but the structure of it, the leverage points, the order in which he needed to reveal what he'd done and what he still could do if pushed. It was, in its own way, no different from planning an assault on a compound: identify the objective, identify the obstacles, sequence the actions that would get him from where he stood to where he needed to end up. The only difference was that this time, the compound was a throne room, and the objective wasn't a target's neutralization but a queen's surrender to terms she hadn't yet realized she was going to. Except, they took him back to the throne room in chains this time, real chains, metal, not the organic cording from before. A sign that whoever had ordered this search had finally understood he was more dangerous than a lost technician, that whatever had happened at the root demanded restraints. The nest itself couldn't quietly reabsorb or regrow. The queen was waiting for him, her crest flared wide, 6 eyes burning with something that translated, even without a device, as fury. "You have been busy," she said, and this time the translator's flat buzz couldn't fully strip the venom from her voice, the words coming faster, sharper than before. "My guards tell me you were found at the root, sabotaging my nest. A soft one. A technician who got lost." Her lower arms flexed, claws extending slightly, catching the bioluminescent light in cold, hungry glints. "I underestimated you. I will not make that mistake twice. You will be executed here, now, publicly, as a lesson to any other soft ones who think my mercy is a weakness to exploit." Jonas said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Every word he'd spent in this room had been spent buying time, and he'd bought exactly as much as he needed and not 1 second more. The guards forced him to his knees before the dais, the same posture as 3 days ago, but everything about the moment had changed, because now he wasn't waiting to be questioned. He was waiting for the structure beneath their feet to answer for him, and every muscle in his body was tuned to the single, quiet thread waiting at the base of the dais. He'd rigged the strut lines to a single convergence point, a length of paracord, tensioned across the deepest of the 3 weakened struts, running back through the chamber he'd been sabotaging, up through a service seam he'd traced on his way down, and finally into this very throne room, disguised as a loose fiber along the base of the dais itself, close enough that he could reach it even bound, if he could just buy one more moment, one more small mercy from a room that owed him nothing. The queen raised a claw, the signal for his execution. Jonas didn't wait for it to fall. He threw himself forward, using the guard's surprise at the sudden movement to close the last few feet toward the dais, and hooked his bound wrists around the fiber-thin cord he'd left waiting there. He pulled, putting his whole body behind the motion, every ounce of weight and momentum he had left after 3 days of captivity and 20 minutes of desperate improvisation. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the chamber began to shake. It started as a low groan, deep beneath the floor, the sound of something enormous under stress, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. Then the bioluminescent growths flickered, dimming and brightening in an arrhythmic pulse that had nothing to do with the nest's usual, steady rhythm. The Queen's crest snapped upright in alarm, her guards turning, weapons raised at nothing, at everything, unable to identify a threat that wasn't standing in front of them because the threat was 3 levels below, in the root chamber, where 3 carefully placed weak points had just failed simultaneously under the accumulated stress of days of patient, invisible sabotage. The central trunk shaft, the one Jonas had traced from the root chamber all the way up to this throne room, buckled. Not catastrophically at first, but enough. Enough for cracks to spider across the ceiling ribs directly above the dais, a network of fractures racing outward faster than the eye could follow. Enough for the Queen herself to recoil, her lower body flowing back off the throne in something that looked, for the first time since Jonas had laid eyes on her, like fear, her 4 arms coming up in an instinctive, protective gesture that had nothing regal left in it at all. The guards broke formation, some rushing to shield the Queen, others turning toward the exits as debris, chunks of dried, brittle outer casing, whole sections of ceiling structure began raining down around them, filling the chamber with dust and the sharp, mineral smell of exposed tissue. Jonas used the chaos exactly the way he'd planned to, twisting free of guards too distracted to hold him properly, moving with the fast, economical violence of a man who had spent 12 years training for exactly 4 seconds like this one. A disarm here, a strike there, not fighting to kill but fighting to clear space, to reach the one target that mattered. Every motion drilled so deep into muscle memory that thought barely entered into it at all. He reached the dais as the ceiling directly above the throne gave way entirely, a section of ribbed structure the size of a small house crashing down not onto the Queen. He'd calculated the collapse pattern as carefully as he'd calculated everything else, angling the weak points so the worst of the debris would fall to the throne's flanks rather than its center, but close enough, loud enough, final enough to end any question of who controlled this room. Dust billowed up in a choking cloud. Somewhere behind him, a guard screamed, a sound quickly cut short beneath falling debris. The throne itself cracked along one edge, a jagged fissure spreading from the point of impact toward the Queen's own trailing lower body. When the dust finally settled, the throne room of the Victory Queen looked less like a seat of power and more like a battlefield. Half her guard detail was buried or scattered, some struggling out from under debris, others simply gone. The ceiling above the dais had opened to the sky in a jagged wound, real daylight, the moon's pale, distant sun, spilling down for the first time in whatever centuries this chamber had existed. Dust motes drifting through the shaft of light like something almost peaceful, almost beautiful, entirely at odds with the wreckage below it. And standing at the base of a Queen who could no longer flee into the depths of her own collapsing nest was a man in a torn, bloodied uniform that no longer looked anything like the harmless technician she'd dismissed 3 days ago. The Queen stared down at him, her 6 eyes wide, her crest flattened against her skull in an expression Jonas didn't need a translator to understand. It was the universal language of a predator realizing, too late, that it had misjudged its prey, a language that apparently translated across species without any device at all. He could have killed her. He'd had 3 days to plan this, and killing her had been on the table the entire time, a clean end to a threat. A decapitation strike in the truest sense, the kind of operation he'd been trained for since before he could legally drink back home. But somewhere between the root chamber and this moment, he'd decided against it, for the same reason he never took a shot he didn't have to take. Dead queens left power vacuums, and power vacuums got Messier, and Messier meant more people, human and otherwise, dying in the chaos that followed. He hadn't spent 3 days building a controlled collapse just to trigger an uncontrolled one, hadn't spent 12 years learning restraint just to abandon it in the one moment that mattered most. You threatened me, he said, quiet, level, the meek voice gone now, replaced by something flat and certain that carried its own kind of weight even without volume behind it. You told your guards I was soft. Unarmored. Not even worth the effort of a hunt. He let that sit in the wreckage-strewn silence for a moment, the dust still settling around them, a few loose fragments of ceiling still pattering down somewhere behind him. You were wrong about what I was. I need you to understand that before we go any further, because everything that happens next depends on you actually understanding it. The Queen said nothing. Around them, what remained of her guard detail hesitated, weapons raised but uncertain, waiting for an order that wasn't coming, because their queen, for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, didn't know what order to give, and a guard who receives no order in a moment like this learns quickly to wait rather than act. I am a soldier, Jonas continued. Trained by my people to survive exactly this. Trained to observe, to wait, to find the weak point in any structure, including this one, and to use it without more violence than the situation requires. I did not come here to destroy your nest. I did not come here to kill you. I came here because your people shot down my ship, and I have spent 3 days finding a way to walk out of your throne room alive, and I am telling you now, plainly, that I have succeeded. He held up his still-bound wrists. The chains had cracked in the fall of debris, hanging loose now, more symbol than restraint. The metal links twisted where a chunk of ceiling had struck them. I could have killed you in the collapse. I chose not to. That was not weakness. That was a decision, and I need you to understand the difference, because the next decision is yours. The Queen's crest slowly rose again, not in aggression this time, but in something closer to calculation, the same cold, evaluating stare she'd given him 3 days ago, except now it carried none of the contempt, only a wary, uncomfortable respect she didn't seem to know what to do with. You could have killed me, she repeated, the translator's flat buzz somehow carrying an edge of genuine disbelief. And you did not. No. Why? Jonas met her eyes, all 6 of them, one row after another, and didn't look away, didn't let the exhaustion of 3 days catch up with him now, not yet, not until this moment had finished playing out. Because there are human prisoners somewhere in your empire. Crews from ships you've shot down, same as mine. I want them back. Alive. All of them. And I think you'd rather negotiate that with a soldier who just proved what he's capable of than fight a war against everyone like him. For a long moment, the only sound in the ruined throne room was the settling of debris and the distant, muffled shouts of guards converging from other levels, still uncertain what had happened, still uncertain whether their queen was alive or already dead beneath the wreckage. She raised one lower claw, slow and deliberate, and the approaching guards froze in place, weapons lowering, the universal shape of an order given without words, a small, exhausted gesture from a ruler who had, in the space of one collapsed ceiling, learned more about her enemy than 3 days of interrogation had managed to teach her. You are not what I threatened, the Queen said finally. You are something my people have never encountered, a soft-seeming thing that conceals a warrior's discipline beneath a civilian's face. If your entire species fights this way, then perhaps a war against you was never the victory my commanders promised me it would be. It wasn't, Jonas said simply. And it still doesn't have to be a war at all. That part is still up to you. They negotiated in the wreckage of the throne room, because there was nowhere else left standing close enough to matter, and because Jonas had learned, over 3 days and one collapsed spinal trunk, that this queen respected demonstrations more than diplomacy, respected shown strength more than spoken promises. He gave her exactly what he'd promised: no further violence, no further sabotage, so long as she gave him what he'd come for. It took the better part of 2 hours to reach terms even a translator device struggling with English's finer points could render clearly enough to trust. The herald returned partway through, badly shaken but functional. His ceremonial scoring cracked along one forelimb where debris had struck him, and he took over translation duties from a lower functionary who had been pressed into the role in the chaos immediately after the collapse. Jonas watched the herald's expression shift, slowly, over the course of the negotiation, from barely concealed hatred to something more careful, more measured, the same recalibration he'd watched happen in the Queen's own eyes. Human prisoners, 6 crews worth, 31 souls scattered across 3 lower detention levels Jonas hadn't even known existed, levels the functionary had never mentioned in 2 days of careless conversation, would be released into his custody. In exchange, he would tell her, honestly, what he'd sabotaged and how, so her engineers could begin repairs before the entire root structure failed completely and took the nest's outer rings down with it. A consequence Jonas had no interest in causing. He'd wounded the beast, not tried to kill it, and he intended to keep that distinction clear all the way to the end. The Queen pressed him on details more than once, testing whether his account of the sabotage held together under scrutiny, whether the man who'd humbled her in her own throne room was also capable of the kind of precise, technical explanation that separated a lucky soldier from a truly dangerous one. He answered every question plainly, walking her engineers, summoned partway through, tentative and clearly terrified to be anywhere near him, through exactly which struts he'd weakened and how, exactly how the nutrient trunk's outer casing dried and cracked under prolonged air exposure, exactly how 3 small, carefully placed wounds had brought down a ceiling 40 meters across. He watched her expression shift again as she listened, from wary respect towards something that might, in a different species, have been called professional admiration. "You could have destroyed everything," she said at one point, almost to herself, her lower arms tracing absent, unconscious patterns against the cracked biomass of her own throne. "The entire root. The entire nest. You had that capability and you chose a wound instead of a killing blow." "I told you why," Jonas said. "I needed something to negotiate with. A dead queen doesn't sign anything." "An honest answer," she said, and something in the flat buzz of the translator almost sounded like it might, with more time and a better device, have carried the shape of respect. "More honest than I expected from a soft one who turned out not to be soft at all." There was a moment, near the end of the 2 hours, when the negotiation nearly broke down entirely. One of the Queen's surviving commanders, an older, heavily scarred guard who had clearly earned his rank the hard way, pushed forward through the wreckage and argued, in a rapid burst of clicks the herald only partially translated, that releasing 31 prisoners in exchange for nothing but a promise was a humiliation the nest could not afford to survive. That word of it would spread to rival hives and invite exactly the kind of predation a wounded queen could least withstand. The Queen listened to the entire argument without interrupting, her crest lowered in what Jonas had come to recognize as thought rather than submission, and then she silenced the commander with a single raised claw and a sentence the translator rendered, imperfectly but unmistakably, as, "A queen who cannot recognize a debt already lost does not deserve to keep her nest standing." Jonas understood, watching that exchange, exactly how much the collapse had cost her politically as well as physically. That every hour she spent negotiating with him was an hour her own commanders spent quietly reassessing whether she remained fit to rule a nest that had just been humbled by a single unarmed prisoner. It didn't change his terms. If anything, it sharpened his resolve to make sure the terms held cleanly enough that neither side could later claim they'd been cheated, because a queen who felt cheated afterward was a queen who might decide, weeks or months down the line, that honoring the agreement cost her more than breaking it. He built extra safeguards into the exchange because of it, a public accounting of the sabotage, delivered in front of her surviving commanders rather than in private, so that no one could later claim the collapse had been anything other than what it was, a deliberate, controlled demonstration rather than an accident she'd been tricked by. The Queen did not thank him. Queens like her, Jonas suspected, did not have a word for gratitude that didn't also mean debt. And debt was not something she seemed willing to owe a species she'd have to explain this humiliation to for generations, to commanders and rivals who would ask, for years to come, how a single unarmed prisoner had done what an entire invading fleet had not yet managed. But she kept her word, which was, in the end, the only currency that mattered between two dangerous parties who had just learned, in the most direct way possible, exactly how much continued conflict would cost them both. He walked out of the nest 4 hours later at the head of a column of 31 human prisoners, pale, thin, disbelieving that rescue had come from inside the belly of the thing that held them rather than from some fleet arriving in force overhead, guns blazing, in the way rescues were supposed to happen in every story any of them had grown up hearing. Some of them wept openly, the sound of it echoing strangely off the nest's living walls. A few of them, veterans themselves, simply nodded at him, a small, exhausted understanding passing between people who recognized in each other the particular look of someone who had survived, something they weren't supposed to survive, who had done the math on their own odds and come out the other side anyway. One of them, a lieutenant from a supply ship Jonas didn't recognize the name of, fell into step beside him partway through the column's slow march toward the surface, her uniform torn and stained but her spine straight in a way 3 days, for her, it turned out, closer to 3 weeks, of captivity hadn't managed to break. "They told us nobody was coming," she said quietly. "Told us it every day. Said your fleet had written the whole system off." "They probably have," Jonas said. "I didn't come as fleet. I came as one guy who crashed into the wrong moon at the wrong time and decided the wrong time might as well be useful." She studied him for a moment, the way soldiers study each other when they're trying to work out exactly what kind of soldier they're looking at. "What are you, exactly?" "Navy SEAL," he said, and left it at that, because it was the truest, simplest answer he had, and because anything more would have taken longer to explain than either of them had breath for on that walk. She laughed, short and disbelieving, the sound rough from 3 weeks of disuse. "A SEAL. Of course. Should have known the moment they marched you in that first day and you didn't so much as flinch. We used to bet on it, down in the lower cells, whether you were some kind of special operator or just the calmest lunatic any of us had ever seen. Petty Officer Alvarez had you pegged as career intelligence. I said career infantry. Nobody guessed the truth, because the truth sounded too much like something out of a recruiting film." "The truth usually does," Jonas said. "Doesn't make it less true." Further back in the column, a young man, barely more than a kid, by the look of him, still in a flight suit 2 sizes too large, the kind of oversized gear that got issued to whoever happened to be standing closest to the supply locker during a scramble, kept glancing over his shoulder at the receding nest every few steps, as if he expected it to reach out and pull them all back in even now, even with open ground finally under their boots. Jonas caught his eye once and offered a small, steadying nod, the kind of gesture that meant nothing and everything at once. "We're clear, keep walking, it's over." The kid straightened his shoulders after that and didn't look back again. At the outer edge of the nest, where the pale, bone-colored trees gave way to open ground and a sky no longer the color of a healing bruise but a clearer, calmer gray, Jonas stopped and looked back one last time. The nest rose behind them, vast and strange and still faintly pulsing, a wound now cut through its very center, the way a snake might carry a scar long after the fight that made it. Somewhere deep inside, a queen who had once called him soft was now overseeing repairs to a spine he had broken with paracord, dried fiber, and 12 years of training she'd never known to look for. Her engineers working through the night by bioluminescent light to shore up struts a single human had known exactly where to weaken. She had threatened him because she had no idea what he was. By the time she found out, it was already too late to matter, and the lesson she'd taken from that mistake would outlast the both of them. The rescue shuttle, flagged down by a distress signal Jonas cobbled together from a prisoner's salvaged transponder, a young engineer from one of the downed crews who turned out to have exactly the kind of scavenging ingenuity Jonas respected in anyone, human or otherwise, arrived 6 hours later, dropping through the moon's thin atmosphere in a column of white fire that felt, after 3 days inside a living nightmare, like the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. As the surviving crews were loaded aboard, exhausted, alive, going home, Jonas stood at the ramp and took one last look at the horizon, at the pale trees and the strange sky and the enormous, wounded shape of the nest still visible in the distance, its silhouette softened now by morning haze into something that almost looked, from this far away, peaceful. He hadn't set out to become a legend that day. He'd set out to survive, then to rescue, then to negotiate a peace neither side particularly wanted but both sides could live with. That was the job. That had always been the job, not the glory, not the story people would eventually tell about him back home, embellished with each retelling until the paracord and dried fiber became something closer to myth, but the quiet, patient work of turning an impossible situation into a survivable one small, careful decision at a time, the same discipline that had carried him through 12 years of missions nobody outside a very short list would ever hear about. Somewhere over the moon's thin, curving horizon, as the shuttle broke atmosphere and the pale trees and wounded nest shrank to a smudge and then to nothing at all, Jonas finally let himself sit down properly for the first time in 3 days, his back against the shuttle's bulkhead, his eyes closing not from surrender but from the simple, earned permission to rest that came only after a job was actually finished. Around him, the rescued crews talked in low, disbelieving voices, some already trying to piece together how they'd describe this to families who wouldn't understand half of it, others simply staring out the small viewports in silence, watching the moon recede, unable yet to quite believe they were leaving it behind for good. Nobody bothered him. Word had already traveled the length of the cramped cabin, crew to crew, about who exactly had walked them out of that nest, and even exhausted, half-starved sailors seemed to understand, instinctively, that the man who'd done it had earned a few hours of being left entirely alone. The debrief, when it finally came, took place 3 weeks later in a gray, windowless room that felt almost comically mundane after everything he'd survived, a folding table, 2 chairs, a recorder blinking its small red light, and an intelligence officer named Reyes who kept glancing up from her notes with an expression that suggested she didn't quite believe what she was writing down, no matter how many times Jonas repeated it, no matter how many corroborating statements from the 30 other rescued crew members landed on her desk to back it up. "You're telling me," she said, for what felt like the 4th time, "that you brought down a structural support column inside an active alien hive using paracord and dried plant fiber." "Not plant fiber," Jonas said, patient, because he understood how it sounded. Understood exactly how thin the line was between a report that got taken seriously and one that got quietly filed away as combat stress. It's closer to cartilage. Dries out and turns brittle if you expose it to open air for long enough. The whole nest depends on that tissue staying moist to hold its shape. Cut off circulation to the right spot, wait, and it weakens itself. I just gave it somewhere to fail. Reyes set down her pen. And the Queen just let you walk 31 prisoners out the front door. Not the front door. And not because she wanted to. He thought back to the throne room, to the crack spreading across her dais, to the particular stillness in her 6 eyes when she'd finally understood what she was looking at. She let us walk out because I gave her a reason to believe letting us walk out cost her less than keeping us. That's the whole trick, with something like her. It's not about being stronger. It's about making sure the math only works one way. It took another hour to get through the rest of it, the crash, the cell, the functionary who'd talked too much, the root chamber, the collapse, the negotiation that followed. Reyes recorded all of it, occasionally shaking her head, occasionally asking a question that circled back to some detail she clearly still couldn't quite fit into her understanding of what a single operator, stranded and unsupported, was supposed to be capable of. By the end, her disbelief had settled into something quieter, something that looked almost like the same wary respect he'd watched dawn on the Queen's face in the wreckage of her own throne room. "Walk me through the collapse again," she said at one point, flipping back several pages in her notes. "Specifically the timing. You're telling me you rigged 3 structural points over the course of roughly 20 minutes, under active search conditions, and then waited, how long, exactly, before triggering it?" "Close to 4 hours, Jonas said. I didn't trigger it the moment I finished rigging it. I triggered it when I was back in the one room where triggering it would actually end the standoff instead of just collapsing an empty chamber underneath guards who'd have simply regrouped and hunted me down in the wreckage. Timing mattered more than the rigging itself. Rig it too early, you lose the element of surprise. Rig it in the wrong room, you kill guards and accomplish nothing strategic. The whole plan was worthless without the right moment to use it in." Reyes made a note, then looked up again. "And you knew, going in, that a collapse of that scale wouldn't kill her?" "I knew it might," Jonas admitted, and this was the one place in the whole debrief where his voice lost some of its flatness, where the weight of the gamble showed through. "I calculated the angles as carefully as I could with what I had, based on 2 days of listening to guard patrols and 1 afternoon actually standing in the root chamber. But I didn't have engineering schematics. I didn't have a model to run the numbers against. I had a knife, some rope, and my best read on how the ceiling ribs would fail under stress. If I'd been wrong, she dies in that collapse, and I'm standing over a corpse with 31 prisoners still scattered across 3 levels I hadn't even confirmed existed yet, and no one left alive with the authority to release them. That was the real risk. Not that the plan wouldn't work. That it would work too well. But it didn't." "No," Jonas said. "It didn't. I got lucky on the margins, same as anybody does eventually, no matter how much planning goes into it. I just made sure the plan was good enough that luck only had to cover the last 5% instead of the whole thing." Reyes sat with that for a moment, tapping her pen once against the folder in front of her. "That's not really how these debriefs usually go," she said. "Most guys who pull off something like this want to tell me the whole thing was skill, start to finish. You're the first one I've had in this chair who's led with how much of it could have gone the other way." "The ones who forget how much could have gone the other way," Jonas said, are usually the ones who don't come back to sit in this chair a second time. For what it's worth, she said, closing her folder, Command's going to want to talk to you about this. Not just the rescue. The terms you negotiated. Nobody's ever gotten a Vectory Hive Queen to the table before. Nobody's ever gotten one to keep her word after either. She kept it because it cost her less to keep it than to break it, Jonas said again, because it was the only explanation that had ever mattered to him. That's not diplomacy. That's just math, same as everything else out there. You make the other side's cheapest option also be the peaceful one, and most of the time, that's the option they take. Reyes studied him for a long moment, the same way the lieutenant on the walk out of the nest had studied him, the way people had started studying him ever since the shuttle touched down, and the story, half of it accurate, half of it already growing in the retelling, began working its way through the fleet. You don't sound like a man who just single-handedly forced a species to reconsider going to war with us. I sound like a man who wants to go eat something that isn't a ration bar, Jonas said, and for the first time since the crash, something like a real smile crossed his face. The rest of it, Command can figure out on its own time. The peace that followed wasn't clean, and it wasn't permanent. Nothing negotiated at the edge of a collapsed throne room ever entirely was. But it held longer than anyone in Command had privately expected, long enough for formal talks to begin, long enough for a handful of cautious trade agreements to take root in the space where open war had, by every intelligence estimate, been only weeks away. The Vectory High Command, it turned out, had been divided even before Jonas's crash, split between factions that wanted immediate, total war and factions that worried, quietly, about the cost of underestimating a species they didn't yet understand. What happened in that Queen's throne room didn't end the argument between those factions. But it tipped the scales, hard, in one direction, and scales tipped that hard didn't tip back easily.